Chapter 9, Part 2 of the Metamorphosis, or Golden Ass. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Thomas Copeland. The Metamorphosis, or Golden Ass, by Apuleius. Translated by Thomas Taylor. Chapter 9, Part 2. Scarcely had the old woman finished her tale, when the baker's wife thus resumed her discourse. "Oh, how blessed is that woman who enjoys the liberty of associating with so firm a friend! But I, miserable creature, have met with a lover who is even frightened at the noise of the mill, and the concealed face of that scabby ass." To this the old woman replied, "I will even now cause that lover of yours to be with you promptly at the appointed time, well persuaded and resolute." And having likewise promised that she should return in the evening, she departed from the bedchamber. But that chaste wife immediately prepared a princely banquet. She defecates by percolation the precious wine, tempers the new-made pottage with seasoning, and furnishes the table with abundance of food. In short, the coming of the adulterer is expected like the advent or manifestation of some god. For opportunely the husband supped abroad at the house of a neighbouring fuller. Midday therefore approaching, I being at length freed from my harness and permitted to refresh myself in quiet, I did not, by Hercules, so much rejoice in my liberation from labour, as that, my eyes being uncovered, I should now be able to behold without restraint all the arts of the wicked woman. The sun, indeed, having now descended under the ocean, had illuminated the inferior parts of the earth, when, behold, the rash adulterer came, closely following the iniquitous old woman, he himself being very young, and still conspicuous by the polished smoothness of his chin, still being himself the delight of adulterers. The woman, having received him with many kisses, desired him to recline himself for the supper she had prepared. But no sooner had the young man touched with the extremity of his lips the cup which was drunk out of previous to eating, and just begun to taste the food, than the husband came, returning much sooner than they expected. Then the egregious wife, having earnestly prayed for dire curses upon him, and wishing that he might break his legs, hid the adulterer, trembling with pale fear, under the wooden bin, which then happened to lie near her, in which a confused heap of corn was usually purified. And by her innate craft, dissembling a deed so wicked, and assuming an intrepid countenance, she inquired of her husband why he came home so prematurely, relinquishing the supper of his most intimate companion. But he, with a mind perfectly afflicted, and continually sighing, said, "Not being able to bear the detestable and extreme wickedness of an abandoned woman, I took myself to flight. Good gods, what a wife! How faithful and how temperate! And yet she defiled herself with a most filthy crime. I swear by this holy Ceres that I can even now scarcely believe the testimony of my eyes concerning such a woman." The most audacious wife of the baker, being incited by these words of her husband, and desiring to know the affair, did not cease to importune him to narrate the whole transaction from the beginning, nor did she desist till her husband complied with her wish. And thus, being ignorant of the misfortune of his own house, he related that of the family of another. "The wife of my associate, the fuller, who seemed to be a woman of undefiled chastity, and who, being always renowned for her modesty, chastely ruled the house of her husband, was inflamed with a secret love for a certain adulterer. And as she continually indulged in furtive embraces with that young man, she was in the act of being connected with him at the very moment of time in which we, having bathed, went to supper. Being therefore disturbed by our sudden presence, she hid him in a wicker coop, which being plaited from willow twigs into an erect heap, and smoked with the white fume of sulphur, was used for the purpose of whitening the cloth that was placed round it. And he being now safely concealed, as it seemed to her, she fearlessly participated with us of the table. In the meantime, the young man, being oppressed and obscured by the odour of the sulphur, became faint through the interception of his breath, and that living mineral caused him to sneeze frequently, as it is natural for it to do. But as soon as the husband, who sat opposite to his wife, heard the sound of sneezing behind his back, because he thought it proceeded from his wife, he wished her well in the usual words, and this he did when he again heard the sneezing, and also when it was frequently repeated, till, being moved by the excessive repetition of it, he at length suspected what the thing was. Immediately, therefore, pushing away the table at which she sat, and removing the coop, he drew forth a man, who was with great pain restoring his frequent emissions of breath. And being inflamed with indignation on account of the disgraceful circumstance, calling for a sword, he longed to kill a man who would have expired in a short time, unless I, considering our common danger, had, though with difficulty, prevented him from his furious attack by assuring him that his enemy would shortly die through the powerful odour of the sulphur, without any blame being attached to us. And he, being rendered more mild, not by my persuasion, but by the necessity of the thing itself, brought him, who was now but half alive, into the next street. Then I secretly admonished, and at length prevailed on his wife, to withdraw herself for a short time from the shop, and betake herself to a certain woman with whom she was familiar, till the enraged mind of her husband should be appeased, who, I did not doubt, was so exasperated and so agitated with fury, that he would certainly perpetrate something more deadly, both on himself and his wife. And thus, being wearied with the supper of my associate, I returned to my own house. While the baker narrated these particulars, that shameless and audacious woman had, long before the tale was finished, expressed by execrations how much she detested the wife of the fuller, calling her perfidious, unchaste, and lastly, the great disgrace of all her sex, who, laying aside her own modesty and trampling on the league of the marriage bed, had defiled with meretricious infamy the house of her husband, and now had procured for herself the name of a prostitute, having lost the dignity of a married woman. She added that such females ought to be burnt alive. Nevertheless, through the joint admonition of her silent wound, and her own filthy conscience, in order that she might sooner liberate her adulterer from the torment of his covering, she frequently urged her husband to go to bed as soon as possible. He, however, mildly requested that the table might be placed for him, as, his supper being intercepted at the house of the fuller, he had fled from thence perfectly hungry. Then the wife hastily set the table before him, though unwillingly, because it was designed for another person. But my bowels were perfectly lacerated when I reflected on the preceding wickedness, and the present audacity of this most abandoned woman, and I sedulously deliberated with myself whether I could by any means give assistance to my master by detecting and revealing the fraud of his wife, and by throwing off the covering, expose to the view of every one him who was concealed like a tortoise under the bin. At length divine providence regarded me, thus tormented with the disgrace of my master, for the lame old man, to whose care our custody was committed, led all us labouring beasts, collected into one body, to the next lake, for the sake of drinking, the time now requiring that this should be done. And this circumstance administered to me a most opportune occasion of revenge, for, in passing by, I observed the extremities of the fingers of the adulterer, which were protuberant through the narrow openings of the hollow covering, and pressing these with my inflected and sharp hoof, I bruised them so as to reduce them to the greatest tenuity, till, being excited by the intolerable pain, he sent forth a sorrowful clamour, and pushing away and throwing down the bin, he unfolded, to the sight of all that were present, the scenic apparatus of the lecherous woman. Nevertheless, the baker, not being greatly disturbed by the loss of his wife's modesty, thus began to soothe, with a serene front and conciliated face, the young man, who was trembling with exsanguous paleness. "You need not fear, my son, that anything of a sorrowful nature will be inflicted on you by me. I am not a barbarian, nor endued with a rustic deformity of manners. Nor will I kill you with the deadly fume of sulphur, after the example of the truculent fuller. Nor indeed will I bring such an elegant and beautiful youth in danger of losing his life, through the severity of the law concerning adultery. But I will divide with my wife my pleasure with you, and she shall be common both to you and me. For I have always lived with my wife in such concord, that, according to the dogma of the philosophers, the same things are pleasing to both of us. But neither does equity suffer the wife to have more authority than the husband. With such like flattering language, having derided the young man, he led him reluctant to a bed, and sending away his most chaste wife, who followed him to another bed, he, lying alone with the youth, enjoyed the most grateful avengement of corrupted nuptials. But as soon as the lucid chariot of the sun had made the day, the baker, having called 2 of his most robust servants, and striking with the ferrule of the buttocks of the youth, who was lifted to a considerable height for the purpose, said to him, "Do you, who are so soft and tender, and but a boy, defrauding lovers, wantonly desire women in the flower of your age, and commit adultery with such as are free, and connected by the conjugal compact, and vindicate to yourself the unseasonable name of an adulterer?" Having reproached him in these and many other words, and besides this punished him abundantly with blows, he turned him out of doors. He, however, being the bravest of all adulterers, having obtained unhoped for safety, though his fair posteriors had been burst by night, and for a long time, sorrowfully fled. Nevertheless, the baker divorced his wife, and immediately thrust her out of her own house. But she, besides her genuine wickedness, being profoundly excited and exasperated by the contumelious language of her husband, though it was just, returned to her treasury of fraud and the accustomed arts of females, and with great care searched for a certain crafty woman, who was believed to be capable of effecting anything by incantations and sorcery, besought her with many prayers, and burdened her with many gifts, requesting of her one of 2 things, to wit, that she would either again cause her to be reconciled to her husband by appeasing him, or, if that could not be accomplished, that she would send some ghost or some dire demoniacal power to take away his life by violent means. Then that sorceress, and who was capable of effecting divine works, employed at first only the milder instruments of her wicked art, and endeavoured to bend the mind of the husband that had been vehemently offended, and impel it to love. But when the event of the thing was different from what she expected, being indignant with the gods, and besides the loss of the gain which she would have obtained if she had succeeded, being also stimulated by the contempt which she had sustained from the divine powers, she now began to attack the life of the most miserable husband, and to stimulate to his destruction the ghost of a certain woman who had suffered a violent death. Perhaps, however, O scrupulous reader, you, reprehending my narration, will argue as follows: "But whence, O foolish ass, could you know what was done by women in secret, as you say you did, when, at the same time, you were confined within the boundaries of a bakehouse? Hear, therefore, how a curious man, sustaining the form of an ass, knew all that was transacted with a view to the destruction of my master, the baker. Nearly about midday, a woman suddenly appeared in the bakehouse, deformed with severe sorrow, as if she was guilty of some crime, half clothed with a coarse mantle, having her feet naked and without shoes. And being thus ill-favoured through leanness, there was in her face a paleness like that of box. Her hair likewise was half grey, torn, and filthy through the interspersion of ashes, and, hanging over her forehead, concealed the greatest part of her face. This woman, thus deformed in her attire, gently with her hand taking hold of the baker, led him into his bedchamber, as if she had something to say to him in secret, and having shut the door, she stayed there a long time. But when all the corn was ground which had been given to the servants of the baker, and it became necessary to ask for more, The lesser men-servants, standing near the bedchamber, called their master by name, and asked for more corn to supply the mill. And as no master answered them, though they frequently called him, and with a loud voice, they now more forcibly knocked at the door. Because likewise it had been most carefully bolted, suspecting something of greater consequence, and of a worse nature than usual, with great effort they at length either plucked off or broke the hinges, and made an entrance for themselves. That woman, however, was nowhere to be found, but they saw their master hanging from a certain beam to which he was tied, and now lifeless. Freeing him, therefore, from the knot by which his neck was fastened, they took him down from the beam with the greatest lamentations and weeping, and procured for his corpse the last ablution. Having likewise performed the offices pertaining to the dead, they buried him, a great crowd attending the funeral. On the following day his daughter came running from the next little town, in which she had lately been married, sorrowful, shaking her pendulous hairs, and sometimes beating her breasts with her hands, for she knew all that happened, though no one had narrated to her the misfortune of the house, because the lamentable form of her father had presented itself to her in sleep, having the neck still tied with a cord, and unfolded to her all the wickedness of her stepmother, the adultery, the enchantment, and how he had descended to the realms beneath, being strangled by a nocturnal ghost. And when she had tormented herself by long-continued lamentation, at length, being restrained by the concourse of her friends and acquaintance, she gave a pause to her grief. And now, the funeral solemnities being in the usual manner completed as his sepulchre, on the 9th day she brought forth the servants, the furniture, and all the labouring beasts to be sold by auction. Then the rash fortune of an uncertain sale dispersed in various ways the property of one house. Lastly, a certain poor gardener bought me for 50 pieces of money, which he said was a great price, but he purchased me in order that he might procure food for himself by our common labour. And the thing itself appears to me to require that I should also explain the discipline of this my servitude. In the morning, my master was accustomed to drive me to the next city, laden with many herbs, and after he parted with them for a certain sum of money, to those who sold them to others, he thus returned to his garden, sitting on my back. But while he was digging and watering and performing other rural works in a bent position, I, in the meantime, being at leisure, refreshed myself with placid quiet. Behold, however, the year running back through the number of days and months, by orderly and established circulations of the stars, had descended to the wintry frosts of Capricorn after the pleasures of the vintages of autumn. But I was tormented by continual cold through the daily rains and the nightly dews, being exposed to the open air and shut up in an uncovered stable. For my master, on account of his great poverty, could not purchase, even for himself, and much less for me, some straw or a small covering, but he lived contented with the leafy umbrage which his little cottage afforded. Besides this, also, in the morning I endured great labour, in walking with unshod feet on excessively cold clay and pieces of very sharp ice, and was not able to fill my belly with my accustomed food. For both my master and myself had an equal and similar supper, and it was very slender, since it consisted of old and unsavoury lettuces, which having, through the great age of the seeds, grown into an irregular height, like long brooms, had degenerated into the bitter putridity of muddy juice. On a certain night, the master of a family of the next village, being impeded by the darkness of a moonless night, and wet through a heavy shower of rain, and in consequence of this prevented from pursuing his journey in the direct road, turned out of the way, with his now wearied horse, to our garden, and being as courteously received as the time would permit, though not in a delicate, yet in a necessary succour of rest, and desiring to remunerate his benignant host, he promised that he would give him from his farm some corn and oil, and besides this 2 caddi of wine. But my master, without delay, proceeded to the village of that master of a family, which was distant from his garden 60 stadia, sitting on my naked back, and bringing with him a little sack and empty bladders. And this journey being now finished, we came to the before-mentioned farm, and there the benignant host immediately gave my master to partake of a sumptuous dinner. While two they were exciting each other alternately to drink, a perfectly stupendous prodigy happened to take place. A hen, belonging to a coop in which others were kept, running through the middle area, made a noise with her native clangour, as if she wanted to lay an egg. Her master, beholding her, said, "O good servant, and sufficiently prolific, who for a long time hast nourished us with the eggs which thou hast daily brought forth, now also, as I see, you think about preparing for us a breakfast. And ho, boy," said he, speaking to one of his servants, "let the basket appointed for the hens, when they are about to lay eggs, be placed in the accustomed corner." While the boy was doing what he was ordered to do, the hen, kicking away the bed which had been made for her, as usual, in the basket, brought forth before the very feet of her master a premature offspring, which was portentous of something very dire. For she did not bring forth an egg, such as we know a hen is accustomed to do, but a chicken, perfectly furnished with feathers and claws, and eyes and voice, and which immediately began to follow its mother. In a similar manner also another prodigy arose, far greater than the former, and at which all men would be justly terrified. For, under the very table which sustained the relics of the dinner, the earth opening itself from the bottom, a most copious fountain of blood burst forth, and many drops rebounding from thence sprinkled the table with gore. At that very moment, likewise, in which all that were present were fixed in astonishment, admiring and trembling at those divine portents, one of the servants ran from the wine cellar, announcing that all the wine, which had long ago been deposited in it, boiled up in all the vessels with a fervent heat, and just as if a large fire had been put under it. In the meantime, also, weasels were seen out of the house, drawing into it a dead serpent. A small green frog leaped out of the mouth of a shepherd's dog, and a ram, rushing on the dog which stood near him, strangled him by one bite. These prodigies, so many and so great, produced an extreme stupor, with great fear, in the minds of the master of that house and all of his family, so that they knew not what should be done first or last, what would more or what would less appease the anger of the gods, or how many and what kinds of expiatory victims should be procured. And while all of them were still torpid through the expectation of some most horrible subject of fear, a certain little servant came running and announced to the master the great and extreme destruction of his family, for he lived full of glory through having 3 sons, now adult, furnished with learning and endued with modesty. Between these young men and a certain poor man, the master of a small cottage, there was an ancient familiarity. But a powerful, rich, and young neighbour, and who badly used the renown of his ancestors' race, possessed ample and fertile fields, contiguous to that small cottage. And as he was powerful in the number of his dependents, and easily accomplished in the city whatever he pleased, he behaved in a very hostile manner to a poor man who was his neighbour, by killing his sheep, taking away his oxen, and trampling on his corn before it was ripe. When also he had now entirely deprived him of the product of his labour, he likewise desired to expel him from the possession of his farm, and, exciting a frivolous controversy about the boundaries of the fields, he vindicated the whole of the land to himself. Then that rustic, who was otherwise a simple, harmless man, seeing himself plundered through the avarice of a rich man, in order that he might at least retain enough of his paternal land for a sepulchre, collected together, with great trepidation, many friends, for the purpose of demonstrating to them what were the boundaries of his land. Among others, those 3 brothers were present, affording some small assistance to the great misfortune of their friend. Nevertheless, the insanely furious rich man, not being in the least terrified or even confused by the presence of many citizens, not only was unwilling to abstain from rapine, but also from intemperance of language. For when they mildly expostulated with him, and endeavoured to mitigate his fierce manners by soothing words, he, immediately swearing most sacredly by his own safety and that of his friends, asserted that he considered the presence of so many mediators to be a thing of small consequence, and lastly, that he would order his servants to take that neighbour of his by the ears, and expel him to a great distance from his little cottage, and that this should be done immediately. When he had thus said, the greatest indignation was excited in the minds of all that heard him. Then one of the three brothers answered without delay, and a little more freely, that he, in vain trusting to his riches, threatened with tyrannic pride, since the poor also are accustomed to be avenged of the insolence of the rich, through the liberal aid afforded by the laws. Such as oil is to flame, sulphur to burning, and a whip to the furies, such was the fuel of these words to this furious man. And now, being insensate even to extreme insanity, and proclaiming that he would send all of them, and their laws too, to be hanged, he ordered the shepherds' dogs to be liberated, and also the mastiffs, that were fierce and cruel, and accustomed to feed on the dead bodies that were thrown into the fields, and besides this, were nourished by the bites with which they everywhere lacerated the passing traveller. And he likewise commanded that they should be urged to the destruction of the men that were present. But these, as soon as by the accustomed signal of the shepherds they were excited and inflamed, rushed on the men with furious rage, being at the same time horrible by their dissonant barking, and attacking, they pluck their flesh and lacerate them with various wounds, nor did they even spare them while they fled, but being more irritated by their flight, more eagerly pursued them. Then, among the condensed slaughter of a trembling and flying multitude, the youngest of the three brothers stumbled against a stone, and having bruised his fingers, was thrown on the ground, and furnished a nefarious feast to those cruel and most ferocious dogs. For immediately, having found a prostrate prey, they tore in pieces the miserable young man, and as soon as the rest of his brothers knew that he was dying, by his piercing cries, they ran, overwhelmed with sorrow, to give him assistance, and rolling their garments about their left hands, they strived to defend their brother, and to drive off the dogs by throwing at them many stones. They could not, however, either terrify or vanquish their ferocity, for the miserable young man, being torn in pieces, immediately died, entreating with his last words that they would revenge the death of their youngest brother on that most filthy rich man. Then the two remaining brothers, not by Hercules so much despairing of as voluntarily neglecting their own safety, hastily attacked the wealthy man, and hurled many stones at him with great ardour and a furious impetus. But the bloody murderer, who prior to this had been exercised in many similar abominable deeds, throwing a lance, pierced one of the two brothers through the middle of the breast. Yet the young man did not fall on the ground, though he was slain and perfectly lifeless, for the lance, which had penetrated through him, and the greater part of which came out at his back, was by the violence of the impulse fixed in the earth, and kept his body suspended by its firmness and rigidity. But one of the servants also, who was tall and robust, giving assistance to that homicide, sent from afar a stone with great force at the right arm of the third brother. But the stone, passing through the extremities of his fingers with a vain impetus, fell to the ground innoxious, contrary to the opinion of all that were present. Nevertheless, this milder event administered to the most sagacious young man some hope of revenge, for, pretending that his hand was debilitated by the blow, he thus addressed the most cruel wealthy man: "Enjoy the destruction of the whole of our family. Feed your insatiable cruelty with the blood of three brothers, and triumph gloriously over your prostrate citizens. Only remember that you will always have some neighbour, though you may give a still greater and greater extent to the boundaries of your lands. For this my right hand, which would have entirely cut off your head, now being bruised, is rendered incapable of effecting this through the iniquity of fate." The furious thief, being exasperated by this speech, seizing a sword, rushed on the most miserable young man, intending to slay him with his own hand. He did not, however, attack one who was weaker than himself, for the young man, unexpectedly resisting, and far contrary to his opinion, seized his right hand with a most strong embrace, and brandishing the sword with a great effort, expelled the impure soul of the rich man by many and frequent blows. And that he might also liberate himself from the hands of his domestics, who were running to the assistance of their master, he immediately cut his throat with the sword, which was yet sprinkled with the blood of his enemy. These were the things which the before mentioned astonishing prodigies had foreshown, and these were the circumstances which were narrated to the most miserable master. Nor could the old man, surrounded by so many evils, utter any word, or even silently weep, but, seizing the knife with which he had then divided among his guests the cheese and other parts of the dinner, he also sorely wounded his own throat with many stabs, in imitation of his most unhappy son, till, falling prone on the table, he washed away with a river of new blood the stains of that portentous blood which suddenly burst forth from the earth. The gardener, commiserating the fate of that house, which was after this manner destroyed in the shortest space of time, and grievously deploring the cruel events which had taken place, and also paying for his dinner with tears, and frequently striking together his empty hands, he immediately got on my back and returned through the road by which we came. His return, however, was not at least innoxious to him, for a certain tall man, who was a legionary soldier, as his dress and appearance indicated, meeting us on the road, asked the gardener, in proud and arrogant language, whither he was leading an empty ass. But my master, who was yet full of grief, and besides this was ignorant of the Latin tongue, silently passed by him. The soldier, therefore, being indignant at his silence, as a mark of contempt, thrust him from my back, at the same time striking him with the branch of a vine which he held in his hand. Then the gardener suppliantly answered that he could not know what he said through his ignorance of the Latin tongue. The soldier, therefore, subjoining in Greek, said, "Whither do you lead this ass?" The gardener answered that he was going to the next city. "But I," said the soldier, "am in want of its assistance, for it is requisite that it should carry from the neighbouring little town, with other labouring beasts, the baggage of our prefect." And immediately laying hold of the rope by which I was led, he began to draw me along. But the gardener, wiping away the blood which trickled from his head through the wound of the former blow, again entreated the soldier to act by him more humanely and mildly, and this he did, conjuring him by his prosperous hopes. "For this ass," said he, "is sluggish, and besides this frequently falls to that detestable disease epilepsy, and it is with great difficulty that he usually carries a few bundles of herbs from a neighbouring garden, and in doing this he is fatigued, and his respiration is languid. So far is he from being adapted to carry larger burdens." After perceiving, however, that the soldier could not be appeased by any prayers, but was in a greater degree incited to his destruction, and that now, having inverted the vine branch, he was preparing to fracture his skull with a larger knot of the branch, he fled to his last resource, and, feigning that he wished to embrace his knees, in order to excite his compassion, he inclined and bent himself, and, taking hold of both his feet, lifted him up, and violently dashed him to the ground. Immediately afterwards, likewise, he struck every part of his face, his hands, and his sides, at one time with his fists, at another with his elbows, and besides this he bit him, and beat him with a stone taken up in the road. Nor could the soldier either resist or by any means defend himself after he was laid prostrate on the ground, but could only frequently threaten that if he rose again, he would cut him in pieces with his sword. The gardener, being admonished by these words, snatched the sword from him, and throwing it to a great distance, again attacked him with severer blows. But the soldier, being prostrate and prevented by wounds from defending himself, as he could not find any other means of safety, feigned that he was dead, which was the only thing that remained for him to do. Then the gardener, taking with him that sword, got on my back, and proceeded rapidly in a direct line to the city, and, not even thinking of at least visiting his own garden, he betook himself to a certain person with whom he was familiarly acquainted, and having narrated to this friend everything which had happened to him, he implored his assistance in his present dangerous situation, and requested that he would conceal him and his ass for some time, till he had escaped a capital indictment by being latent for 2 or 3 days. But this acquaintance, not being forgetful of ancient friendship, promptly received him, and having drawn me, my legs being folded together, by means of a ladder into the highest room of the house, the gardener crept into a certain chest that was in the cellar, and covering himself over with the lid of it, there lay concealed. The soldier, however, as I afterwards learnt, being at length roused, as if from excessive intoxication, nevertheless staggering and feeble, from the pain of so many wounds, and scarcely able to support himself by a staff, came into the city, and fearing to mention to any one of the citizens any particulars of his violence and inertness, but tacitly devouring the injury he had sustained, when he met with some of his fellow soldiers, he then told them of his misfortune. But they were of opinion that he should conceal himself for some time in their military dwelling, for besides his own proper disgrace, he feared also the military genius who presides over the military oath, on account of the sword which he had lost. They, however, having observed our footsteps, diligently applied themselves to the discovery of us, and to their own revenge. Nor was a perfidious neighbour wanting, who told them that we were there concealed. Then his fellow soldiers went to the magistrates, and pretended that they had lost on the road a very valuable silver vessel belonging to their prefect, and that a certain gardener had found it, and was unwilling to restore it, but was now concealed in the house of a friend. Then the magistrates, becoming acquainted with the loss, and the name of the prefect, came to the gate of our dwelling, and with a loud voice announced to our host that it would be better for him to deliver us up, who were certainly concealed in his house, than to undergo the danger of losing his life. But he, not being in the least terrified, and consulting the safety of him whom he had taken under his protection, did not confess anything concerning us, and asserted that he had not seen that gardener for some days. On the contrary, the soldiers, swearing by the genius of the emperor, affirmed that he was concealed there, and not in any other place. At length, however, the magistrates were determined, by investigation, to confute him in his obstinate denial. Having therefore sent the lictors into his house, and the other public ministers, they ordered them diligently to explore everything in all the corners of the apartments. But they, having searched, declared that no man, nor even the ass itself, were to be found in any part of the house. Then the altercation became more vehement on both sides, on the part of the soldiers, who asserted that we were certainly there, and frequently implored the assistance of Caesar, and on the part of the master of the house, who denied the accusation, and continually called the gods to testify the truth of what he said. I, therefore, who was in other respects an inquisitive ass, and endued with a restless petulance, when I heard the contention and clamorous murmur, was desirous, by looking through a certain window with my neck in an oblique position, to see what was the meaning of that tumult. And while I was so doing, one of the soldiers, having by chance turned his eyes to my shadow, called all of them to be witnesses of it publicly. Lastly, a great clamour was presently raised, and certain persons immediately coming to me by the assistance of ladders, laid their hands on me, and drew me from the place of my concealment as a captive. And now, without any delay, more carefully exploring everything, and uncovering also the chest, they found the miserable gardener, drew him out from thence, presented him to the magistrates, and led him to a public prison, in order that he might suffer capital punishment. Nor could they refrain from jesting, accompanied with the greatest laughter, at my looking out of the window. Whence also the proverb originated, which is very much used concerning the inspection and shadow of an ass. End of Chapter 9, Part 2. Recording by Thomas Copeland.
One of the Metamorphosis, or Golden Ass. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tim Ferreira. The Metamorphosis, or Golden Ass, by Apuleius. Translated by Thomas Taylor. Chapter 10, Part 1. What my master the gardener did, on the following day, I know not. But the soldier, who was most beautifully beaten, on account of his extreme imbecility, loosened me, and brought me away from that manger, without the prohibition of any one. From his own tent also, as it appeared to me, he led me into the public road, laden with his own bundles, and perfectly adorned and equipped in a military manner. For he placed on my back a glittering helmet, a shield far more splendid than the rest of the armour, and also a lance, conspicuous for its very long steel head, which he diligently disposed on the top of the bundles, as it is usual to do in an army, not then, indeed, for the sake of discipline, but for the purpose of terrifying miserable travellers. Having, therefore, passed over the plains, which was attended with no difficulty, we came to a certain little town, nor did we then betake ourselves to an inn, but to the house of a decurion. And when the soldier had delivered me to the care of a certain servant, he, without delay, solicitously proceeded to his own prefect, who had the command of 1,000 soldiers. I remember that a most wicked and detestable deed was perpetrated in that town a few days after our arrival, but I will insert it in my book, that you also may read it. The master of that house had a son, who was a young man of great literary attainments, and, on that account, was consequently remarkable for his piety and modesty, so that you also would wish to have him, or his like, for a son. The mother of this young man having been dead for many years, the father had married again, and from another wife had begotten another son, who had now just passed beyond the 12th year of his age. But the stepmother, who was powerful in the house of her husband, rather from her beauty than the worthiness of her manners, regarded her son-in-law with wanton eyes, whether she was naturally immodest, or was impelled by fate to that extreme wickedness. Now, therefore, excellent reader, know that you will peruse a tragedy and not a comedy, and that you will ascend from a shoe to the buskin. As long, however, as the amatory desire which she nourished from the beginning was small, its force being yet imbecile, the woman, easily repressing the slender frame, resisted it in silence. But when love, immoderately raging, burnt the whole of her breast with an insane fire, she was then vanquished by the fierce and tyrannical god, and, feigning illness, she pretended that her disease was not mental, but occasioned by the languid state of her body. Now there is not any one who is ignorant that all the detriments which the health and the face sustain accurately accord both with those that are ill and those that are in love, such as a deformed paleness, marcid eyes, weary legs, turbulent sleep, and sighs, more vehement from the slowness of the torment by which they are produced. You might believe she was only agitated by feverish vapours, if she had not also wept. Alas, unskilful physicians, what do the pulsation of the artery, immoderate heat, wearied respiration, and the frequent and reciprocal changes and turnings of the sides indicate? Good gods! How easy is the comprehension of amatory desire by one who is learned, though he does not profess the medical art, when he sees some one burning with bodily heat. Being, therefore, more profoundly agitated by the impatience of venereal fury, she at length burst her long silence, and ordered her son to be called to her, which name she would have willingly obliterated in him, in order that she might not, by using it, be admonished of her shameless passion. Nor did the young man make any delay in obeying the mandate of his diseased parent, but, having his forehead wrinkled with sorrow for her pretended illness, like that of an old man, he went into the bedchamber of the wife of his father and the mother of his brother, paying that obedience to which was, in a certain respect, her due. But she, being for a long time fatigued by tormenting silence, and hesitating, as in a shallow of doubt, rejecting every word, which she, at first, conceived to be most adapted to the present occasion, and even now fluctuating through shame, she was dubious when she should assume the exordium of her speech. The young man, however, not then suspecting anything sinister, with a dejected countenance spontaneously asked her, what were the causes of her present disease? Then she, availing herself of the pernicious opportunity afforded by solitude, burst out into audacity, and weeping abundantly, and hiding her face with her garment, with a trembling voice thus briefly addressed him: "You yourself are the whole cause and origin of this my disease, and you are also the remedy and the only health of my life. For those eyes of yours, having penetrated through my eyes into the most inward recesses of my breast, have there excited a most vehement fire. Take pity, therefore, on me, who am perishing for your sake. Nor should your reverential regard for your father at all deter you, since, by complying with my wishes, you will preserve for him a wife, who must otherwise die. For I justly love you, in consequence of recognizing his image in your face. You will be perfectly secure, on account of the solitude of the place, and you will also have leisure sufficient for the accomplishment of this necessary crime. For that which no one knows has nearly no existence." The young man, being disturbed by the sudden evil, though he immediately abhorred such an abominable deed, yet did not think it fit to exasperate her by the unseasonable severity of a denial, but to appease her by the procrastination of a crafty promise. He promised, therefore, abundantly, and earnestly persuaded her to keep up her spirits, restore her strength by nutriment, and pay attention to her health, till a free space of time should be granted to pleasure, by some journey of his father. And he immediately withdrew himself from the noxious view of his stepmother. Conceiving likewise that this great destruction with which his house was threatened required more abundant counsel, he immediately related the affair to a certain aged tutor of well-tried gravity and prudence. And, after long continued deliberation, nothing seemed to be so salutary as to escape the tempest of raging fortune by a rapid flight. But the woman, being impatient even of the smallest delay, having devised a certain occasion, immediately persuaded her husband, with wonderful art, to take a journey, with all speed, to certain little farms which were situated at a great distance. Which being done, she, precipitately, urged by the insanity of accelerated hope, demands the accomplishment of the promised gratification of her lust. The young man, however, avoids her execrable sight, adducing at one time this thing, and at another that, as the cause of his delay. Till she, manifestly perceiving from the variety of his messages that he refused to fulfil his promise to her, transferred, with a lubricous mobility, her nefarious love to a far more pernicious hatred. And immediately calling a most iniquitous servant, whom she had brought with her dowry to her husband, and who was prepared for the perpetration of any wickedness, she communicated to him the counsels of her perfidy, nor did any thing seem to them to be better than to deprive the miserable young man of life. She immediately therefore sent this villainous servant to buy the most effective poison, and having diligently diluted it with wine, she prepared it for the destruction of her innocent son-in-law. And while the wicked servant and stepmother deliberate with themselves about the fit time of giving him the poison, it happened that the junior youth, who was the proper son of this most abandoned woman, returning home after the labour of his morning studies, and being thirsty after taking his breakfast, found the cup of wine, in which the enclosed poison was concealed, and drank it up at one draught, being ignorant of the latent fraud which it contained, who, as soon as he had drank the death which had been prepared for his brother, fell lifeless on the ground. Immediately the tutor of the youth, being agitated by his sudden death, called the mother and all the family, with a howling clamour. And now, the case of the noxious potion being known, each of those that were present ascribed to different authors the nefarious deed. But that dire woman, and who was a singular example of novercal malice, not being at all moved by the bitter death of her son, nor by the consciousness of parricide, nor by the misfortune of her house, nor the grief of her husband, nor funereal sorrow, took a shorter method of revenge, by the destruction of her family. She immediately, therefore, sent a courier to inform her husband, on his journey, of the calamity that had befallen his house. And on his arrival, he having rapidly returned, she, assuming excessive audacity, pretended that her son was destroyed by poison, administered to him by her son-in-law. And, in asserting this indeed, she did not altogether speak falsely, because the boy had preoccupied the death which was prepared for the young man. But she feigned that the younger brother was destroyed through the wickedness of her son-in-law, because he was unwilling to give assistance to the disgraceful lust by which her son-in-law had endeavoured to commit adultery with her. Nor was she contented with lies so enormous, but she also added, that he threatened her with a sword, because she had detected his wickedness. Then the unhappy man, being greatly afflicted by the death of both his sons, is agitated like the waves of the sea, with mighty tempests of sorrow. For he saw his younger son buried before his face, and he knew that his other son would certainly be condemned to death for incest and parricide. Besides this, also, he was impelled to extreme hatred of this son by the feigned lamentations of his too dearly beloved wife. Scarcely, therefore, were the funeral rites pertaining to the interment of his son performed, when immediately the miserable old man hastily proceeded from his pyre to the forum, irrigating his face with tears yet recent, and tearing his hoary hairs, defiled with ashes. And there, with all his passions at work, he endeavours to procure the destruction of his remaining son, both by tears and supplications, and, for this purpose also, embracing the knees of the senators, being ignorant of the fraud of the most abandoned woman, he exclaimed that his son was incestuous, through his attempting to violate the paternal bed, a parricide through the death of his brother, and a matricide, because he had attempted to kill his stepmother. Lastly, thus lamenting, he inflamed with so much commiseration, and with such great indignation, the senate and the people, that, laying aside the tediousness of a judicial process, and the manifest proofs of accusation, and also the meditated labyrinths of answer, they all cried out that a public evil should be punished publicly, and that the author of it should be destroyed by being overwhelmed with stones. In the meantime, the magistrates, through the fear of peculiar danger, namely, lest sedition should proceed from the small elements of indignation, to the destruction of discipline in the city itself, began partly to beseech the senators, and partly to restrain the people, that sentence might be pronounced conformably to the civil law, judgment being properly passed according to the custom of their ancestors, and the allegations on both sides equitably examined. They added, that no one should be condemned without a hearing, after the manner of barbaric fierceness, or tyrannic violence, since by doing so they would leave, in this time of profound peace, a dire example to posterity. The salutary counsel pleased them, and immediately the crier was ordered to proclaim that the senators should assemble together in the Senate House. But when these were seated in their accustomed places, according to the order of their dignity, the crier again calling, the first accuser came forward. Then, in the last place, the defendant also being cited, was introduced. And the crier, in conformity to the Attic law, and that of the Areopagus, announced to the advocates that they should plead without preambles, and without endeavoring to excite commiseration. I knew that these things were thus transacted from what was said by many in their conferences with each other. But as I was not present at the trial, because I was tied to the manger, I could not know what words the accuser employed, nor by what arguments the defendant confuted him, nor, in short, what were the speeches and answers, nor can I narrate to you things of which I am ignorant, but I shall only commit to writing what I have found to be certainly true. For as soon as the contention of the orators was finished, the senators thought fit that the truth and credibility of the crime should be shown by certain proofs, and that a thing of such consequence should not be left to suspicions and conjecture. They likewise thought it requisite that the servant who was said to be the only one that knew these things were thus transacted, should by all means be brought forward. Nor was that disciple of the cross in the least disturbed, either by the doubtful event of so great a prosecution, or by the view of a full court, or even by his own evil conscience, but began to affirm and assert those things which he had himself devised, as if they were true. For he said, that the young man being indignant with the fastidiousness of his mother-in-law, had called him, that in order to avenge the injury he had ordered him to destroy her son, that he had promised him a great reward if he was silent, that on his refusing to do what he wished, he had threatened him with death, that he had delivered to him the poison diluted with his own hand, to be given to his brother, and that on his suspecting he had neglected to give him the potion, and had reserved it for a proof of the crime, he at length had extended it to the boy with his own hand. When this villainous knave, with a feigned trepidation, had uttered these egregious lies, which had very much the appearance of truth, the inquiries and proofs were finished. Nor was any one of the senators so favorable to the young man as not to pronounce that he ought to be sewed up in a leathern sack, as he was evidently found to be guilty of the crime of which he was accused. The opinions of all of them being concordant, according to the custom perpetually observed, they were to have been committed to writing in tablets or shells, and put into an urn, after which the die being cast, it was not lawful for anything to be changed, but the life of the accused person was in the hand of the executioner. Before this, however, could be done, a certain physician belonged to the senate, of an advanced age, of transcendent fidelity, and of great authority, covering with his hand the orifice of the urn, lest any one should rashly put into it his shell, thus addressed the court: I rejoice that I have lived long, because, even as far as to this period of my life, I have obtained your approbation. Nor will I suffer a manifest homicide to be perpetrated, since this defendant is accused of false crimes, nor you who, being bound by an oath, act as judges, to commit perjury, being induced to do so by the lying testimony of a servant. I myself cannot bear to decide iniquitously, deceiving my own conscience, and trampling on the reverence which is due to the gods. Learn, therefore, from me the truth of the affair. This villainous fellow, being solicitous to procure the most effective poison, which he said was necessary for a certain sick person, who being vehemently afflicted by the long continuance of an incurable disease, was anxious to withdraw himself from the torments of life. This fellow came to me some time ago, and offered me 100 golden solidi, which is to say 100 shillings, for the purchase of the poison. But I, perceiving the vain blabbering of that iniquitous knave, and that he assigned unappropriate causes, and also being certain that he was about to perpetrate something iniquitous, I gave him indeed a potion, but providing for an investigation into the affair which might be made at some future time, I did not immediately accept the price which he offered me. But I said to him, lest by chance some one of these golden solidi which you offer me should be found to be bad, or adulterated, deposit them in this bag, and impress it with your own seal, till they are tomorrow examined in the presence of a banker." Being persuaded by what I said, he sealed the money, which, immediately after he was brought here to give evidence, I ordered one of my servants to take speedily from my shop and bring it to this place. And behold, I will exhibit them to you taken out of the bag. Let him see and recognize his own seal, for how can the son-in-law of the stepmother be accused of having procured the poison which this servant bought?" After this, a great trepidation seized the villain, a deadly paleness succeeded to his native colour, and a cold sweat ran through all his members. Then he began to move his feet with uncertain alternations, to scratch now this, now that part of his head, and to utter foolish I know not what trifles, stammering with a half-closed mouth, so that no one could justly think him to be entirely innocent of the crime. His craft, however, being again restored, he did not cease to deny the charge most firmly, and to accuse the physician of a lie. But the physician, independently of his being bound by oath to decide justly, when he saw that his honour was openly lacerated, endeavoured, with an increased effort, to confute that nefarious knave, till the public servants, by order of the magistrates, taking hold of the hands of the most iniquitous servant, found the iron ring, and compared it with the seal of the bag, which comparison corroborated the preceding suspicion. Nor were the wheel and the rat called Apuleius wanting, prepared for the purpose of tormenting him, after the manner of the Greeks. But he, being strengthened by a wonderful audacity, did not succumb to any blows, nor even the fire itself. Then the physician said, "I will not suffer, by Hercules, I will not suffer, either that you should punish that innocent young man unjustly, or that this fellow should escape the punishment of his nefarious deed, our judgment being frustrated. For I will give you an evident proof of the present affair. When this most abandoned man was anxious to procure the deadly poison, but I did not think it accorded with my art to administer to any one the causes of death, having learnt that medicine was not sought after for the destruction, but for the preservation of men, fearing lest if I refused to give it to him I should open for him a path to wickedness by an unseasonable repulse, and that he would accomplish the nefarious design he had begun, either by buying a deadly potion from some other person, or lastly by the sword, or some different weapon. Fearing this, I gave him not poison, but a preparation of that somniferous plant mandrake, famous for the torpor which it occasions, and which produces a sleep most similar to death. Nor is it wonderful that this most desperate knave, being certain of suffering the extreme punishment which must befall him conformably to the custom of our ancestors, should easily endure these torments, as things of a lighter nature. But if the boy has really taken the potion which was tempered by my hands, he still lives, is in a quiescent state, and sleeps. And immediately on the oppressive sleep being dissipated, he will return to the lucid day. But if he has truly perished, if he is truly overtaken by death, you may from other sources investigate the causes of his destruction." The old man having thus addressed the senators, they assented to what he said, and immediately proceeded with great haste to that sepulchre, in which the body of the boy was deposited. There was not any one of the senate, nor any one among those of the first rank, that did not run thither impelled by curiosity. And behold, the father himself, having with his own hands removed the lid of the coffin, found his son rising from death, the deadly sleep being just then dissipated. And having most closely embraced him, and not being able to express in words his present joy, he led him forth to the people, and the boy was brought into court in the condition in which he still was bound and wrapped in funeral garments. Now, likewise, the naked truth was obvious to every one, the wickedness being manifested of the most iniquitous servant, and of the still more abandoned woman. And the stepmother, indeed, was condemned to perpetual exile, but the servant was hanged, and by the consent of all, the golden solidi were given to the good physician, as the reward of the opportune sleep which he had procured. Thus the famous and fabulous fortune of that old man received a termination worthy the providence of the gods, since in a slender moment, or rather in the smallest point of time, he suddenly became the father of 2 young men, after he had been in danger of losing both. But I, at that time, was rolled about by such tempestuous waves of fate as the following. That soldier who brought me without any one selling me, and who made me his own without price, paying due obedience to the mandate of his tribute, being about to carry letters to the great prince, which is to say to the emperor, towards Rome, sold me for 11 pence to 2 servants in the neighbourhood, who were brothers. The master of these was a very opulent man, but one of them was a confectioner, who made bread and eatables tempered with honey, and the other was a cook, who by the assistance of heat made minced meat seasoned with the sweetest juices of bruised herbs and aromatics. These 2, dwelling together, lived in common, and bought me for the purpose of carrying those numerous vessels which were necessary to their masters for various uses, when they travelled through many regions. I was taken, therefore, as a third companion with those, not having at any time of my transformation experienced a fortune so benevolent. For, in the evening, after most sumptuous suppers, and the most splendid apparatus of them, my masters were accustomed to take into their own little room many fragments. One of them, the most ample remains of pigs, chickens, fishes, and mincemeat of every kind; but the other, bread, pastry, spice cakes, tarts in the shapes of hooks and lizards, and many honeyed sweetmeats. When these two, having fastened the door of their chamber, went to the baths, for the sake of refreshing themselves, I abundantly feasted myself on the dainties which were offered to me through the favour of the gods. For I was not so stupid, and so truly an ass, as to eat very hard and rough hay, neglecting that most delicious food. And for a long time indeed the artifice of my theft succeeded most beautifully, because as yet I stole timidly, and in a sufficiently sparing manner, a few things out of so many, and they did not suspect any fraud in an ass. But when becoming still more confident of concealment, I devoured the most exquisite fragments, and, rejecting the more rancid, began to eat the sweeter morsels, no small suspicion stimulated the minds of the brothers. And though they did not then believe any such thing of me, nevertheless they diligently investigated the author of their daily loss. At length also they accused each other of that most disgraceful rapine. And now they bestowed greater care and a more vigilant observation, and counted the fragments. At length, being no longer restrained by bashfulness, one of them thus addressed the other: "It is neither equitable nor courteous that you should daily purloin the choicest parts, and by selling them, latently increase your wealth, and yet contend for an equal division of what remains. For in short, if our partnership is displeasing to you, we may indeed remain brothers, so far as pertains to everything else, and yet depart from this bond of communion. For I see that complaint of the loss, proceeding to infinity, nourishes very great discord between us." To this the other replied: "I also, by Hercules, applaud your perseverance, that after you have daily and secretly stolen fragments, you have prevented the complaint, which I have for a long time silently and sorrowfully retained, lest I should seem to accuse my brother of sordid rapine. But it is well, that by speaking to each other we seek a remedy for our loss, lest our dissembled hatred increasing by silence, should excite in us Eteoclean contentions." After these, and other similar reproaches arising from their mutual altercation, they both of them swore that they had not committed any fraud nor any theft, but agreed that they ought by all possible means to search after the thief, who was the cause of their common loss. For they said, it was not possible that the ass, which alone was present, could be delighted with such kind of food, and yet the choicest portions of it were daily not to be found. They added, that neither did flies so large as were the harpies of old, who took away by violence the foods of Phineus, wing their way into their apartment. In the meantime, I, being largely fed with dainty morsels, and abundantly satisfied with human food, filled my body with gross fat, rendered my hide soft with succulent suet, and nourished my hairs with a liberal neatness. But that gracefulness of my body produced a great disgrace to my modesty. For they being excited to suspicion by the unusual distension of my hide, and perceiving that my hay remained daily untouched, they now directed all their attention to me. And having as usual shut the doors at the accustomed hour, as if they were going to the baths, they beheld me through a certain small chink, intently eating the fragments which were everywhere exposed. Now, therefore, laying aside all concern for their loss, they burst into a loud laugh, admiring the monstrous delicacies of an ass, and having called many of their fellow servants, they pointed out to them the voracity of a sluggish ass, a thing horrible to relate. At length laughter so great and so unrestrained seized on all of them, that it also reached the ears of the master, who was passing that way. He, therefore, inquiring what good had occurred to make his servants laugh so excessively, and having learnt what the affair was, he, likewise, looking through the same chink, was extremely delighted. And afterwards, he also breaking out into laughter so unrestrained as to cause pain in his intestines, and having opened the door of the chamber, came nearer to me, and considered me more attentively. For I, beholding the countenance of fortune in a certain respect smiling more propitiously upon me, continued eating tranquilly, not in the least disturbed. The joy of those that were present afforded me confidence, till the master of the house being exhilarated by the novelty of this spectacle, ordered me to be led to the supper room, or rather he brought me to it with his own hands, and the table being furnished, he directed every kind of solid food to be placed before me, and such delicacies as had not been touched. But I, though I was well crammed, yet desiring to render myself more acceptable and more commendable to him, ate as if I had been hungry of the food that was placed before me. For they, prompted by curiosity, thinking of everything which an ass mostly abhors, offered it to me, for the purpose of exploring my mildness, such as flesh seasoned with the juice of the herb masterwort, birds sprinkled over with pepper, and fish that had been pickled. In the meantime the banquet resounded with excessive laughter. End of Chapter 10, Part 1. Part 2 of the Metamorphosis, or Golden Ass. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Tim Ferreira. The Metamorphosis, or Golden Ass, by Apuleius. Translated by Thomas Taylor. Chapter 10, Part 2. At length a certain buffoon who was present said, "Give some wine to this guest." To which the master assenting answered, "Knave, you have not spoken absurdly, for it is very possible that our comrade will also willingly drink a cup of mead." And he said, "Come hither, boy, wash well that golden cup, fill it with mead, and offer it to my parasite, and at the same time admonish him that I have previously drank to him." After this, the great expectation was exciting among the guests. Nevertheless, I, not being at all disturbed, drank at one draught all that was contained in that most capacious cup, leisurely, and in a sufficiently pleasant manner, incurvating the extremity of my lip in the shape of a tongue. A clamour was raised, through all of them, with one according voice, drinking my health. Lastly, the master, being excessively joyful, and having called the servants that bought me, ordered that 4 times the sum which they paid for me should be given to them, and he delivered me to a certain person who had been his slave, but was now manumitted, to whom he was very much attached, and who was very rich, and desired him to pay me every requisite attention. This man nourished me in a sufficiently humane and kind manner, and, that he might render himself more acceptable to his patron, most studiously furnished him with delight through my pleasantry. And, in the first place, indeed, he taught me to sit down at table, leaning on my elbow; afterwards to wrestle, and to dance, my forefeet being elevated; and, which was especially admirable, to use signs instead of words, so that I could indicate what I wished by raising, and what I did not wish by declining my head. He also taught me, when I was thirsty, to look at the cup-bearer, and to ask for drink by alternately closing my eyes. And to all these things I was very readily obedient, which, indeed, I should have done, though no one had shown me how to do them. But I was fearful, lest, if I should happen to perform them, after the manner of men, without a master, most would think it portended sinister events, and that I, as a monster and prodigy, should lose my head, and be given for fat provender to vultures. And now my fame was spread abroad publicly, by which I rendered my master illustrious and famous, through my wonderful arts. "This," said the people, "is the man who has an ass for his guest and associate, an ass that wrestles and dances, that jests and understands the language of men, and indicates what it means by nods." It is now, however, requisite that I should inform you, though I ought to have done it in the beginning, who that Thyasus was, or whence he originated, for this was the name of my master. The country in which he was born was Corinth, which city ranks as the chief of all the province of Achaia; and, as he had gradually obtained all the honours which his pedigree and dignity demanded, he had been appointed to the office of quinquennial magistrate. In order, therefore, that he might act conformably to the splendour of that office, he had promised that he would exhibit, during the space of 3 days, the spectacle of prize-fighting, but he had still more amply extended his munificence. Lastly, he had then also come to Thessaly, through the desire of public glory, in order to procure from thence the most noble wild beasts and famous gladiators. And now, having bought and disposed of everything according to his wish, he was preparing to return home. Despising, however, his own most splendid chariots, and undervaluing his beautiful coaches and wagons, which were drawn along empty at the extremity of his train, some of them being covered, and others open; neglecting also the Thessalian horses, and his other Gallic labouring beasts, by which a generous offspring bears testimony to the precious dignity of its origin; despising and neglecting all these, he rode most lovingly on me, who was decorated with golden trappings, dyed saddles, purpled coverings, silver bridles, painted girths, and very sonorous little bells, and sometimes he spoke to me in the most courteous language. Among many other things also which he said, he professed to be in the highest degree delighted that he possessed in me at one and the same time a companion and a carrier. But when, having finished our journey, partly by land and partly by sea, we came to Corinth, a great crowd of citizens ran to meet us, not so much for the purpose of doing honour to Thyasus, as from a desire of seeing me; for so great a rumour had pervaded that city about me, that I was the source of no small gain to my governor; who, when he perceived many longings with great desire to see my sports, he shut the door, and introduced each of them separately, having first received money from them, by which means he was accustomed daily to collect no small sums. In that assembly there was a certain matron, powerful and opulent, who, after the manner of the rest, having purchased a sight of me, and from thenceforth was delighted with my multiform pastimes, fell, at length, gradually, through her continual admiration, into a wonderful desire of enjoying me, and, not applying any remedy to her insane lust, ardently waited for my embraces, like an asinine Pasiphae. At length she prevailed on my keeper, for a great sum of money, to let me lie with her for one night. But that knave, in order that he might derive advantage from me, being only satisfied with his own gain, assented. And now, the laborious and wakeful night being finished, the woman withdrew from my embraces, avoiding the conscious testimony of the light, and making a contract with my keeper for some future night, at the same price. Nor did he unwillingly accede to her voluptuous desires, partly induced by the very ample reward which he received from her, and partly through the opportunity afforded him of preparing a new spectacle for his lord, to whom, without delay, he unfolded the whole scene of our lust. But he, having magnificently rewarded his manumitted servant, destined me to be shown in public. And, because that egregious wife of mine could not be publicly connected with me, on account of her dignity, nor any other could be found for the same purpose, a certain vile woman, who had been sentenced by the prefect to be devoured by wild beasts, was procured, for a great sum of money, to have connection with me in the enclosure of the theatre, in the sight of all the spectators. Of this woman I have heard the following history. She had a husband, a young man, whose father, undertaking a journey, ordered his wife, who was the mother of that same young man, and whom he left oppressed with the burden of pregnancy, that if she brought forth an infant of the inferior sex, she should immediately cause that of which was delivered to be slain. But she, during the absence of her husband, having brought forth a girl, and being moved by the pious affection naturally inherent in a mother, revolted from the mandate of her husband, and delivered it to be nourished by one of her neighbours. Her husband also now having returned, she told him that she had been delivered of a daughter, and that she was destroyed. But as soon as the flower of age required a nuptial day should be appointed for the virgin, and as she could not give a dowry suitable to the parentage of her daughter, unknown to her husband, she did that which she could alone do. Namely, she unfolded the secret to her son, which had hitherto been concealed in silence. For she was very much afraid, lest he, by some accident, erring through the impulse of juvenile ardour, should ignorantly have connection with his sister, who also was ignorant that he was her brother. But this young man, who was remarkably pious, and who religiously obeyed the mandates of his mother, and performed the duties due to his sister, delivered the arcana of his house to the custody of venerable silence, exhibiting only by his countenance a vulgar benevolence toward his sister. And he undertook in such a way to perform the necessary duty of consanguinity, that he received her into the protection of her own house, as if she had been some desolate neighbouring virgin, and deprived of the guardian care of her parents. And soon after, he placed her with a certain most dear associate of his, and most liberally bestowed on her a dowry from his own property. But these things being well disposed, and in the best manner, and with all sanctity, could not escape the deadly knot of fortune, by whose impulse a cruel rivalship immediately directed its course to the house of the young man. And the same wife of his, who now was condemned to wild beasts for these very crimes, began first to entertain a suspicion of the girl, as the rival of her bed, and a harlot. In the next place to defeat her, and in the third place to contrive the most cruel snares for her destruction. In the last place, she devised the following wicked stratagem. Having stolen the ring of her husband, she went into the country, and from thence sent a servant who was faithful indeed to her, but perfectly hostile to fidelity herself, and told him to inform the girl that the young man was gone to her village, and desired her to come to him, and added, that she was to go alone, with all possible celerity, and without any attendant. And, lest any doubt should happen to arise in her mind about the propriety of going, she delivered to him the ring which she had taken from her husband, which, being shown, would give credibility to his words. But she, complying with the mandate of her brother, for she alone knew that he was her brother, and having also inspected his seal which was shown to her, strenuously hastened to go unattended as she was desired to do. As soon, however, as through the deception of extreme fraud she fell into the snares which were prepared for her, then that egregious wife, being insanely excited by the stimulus of libidinous fury, in the first place indeed, having stripped her naked, whipped her even to the extremity of torment, and afterwards, though she explained the thing as it really was, and also exclaimed, that she in vain boiled over with indignation, through conceiving her to be a harlot, and frequently repeated the name of her brother, she slew her by thrusting a burning torch into her private parts, as if she had lied and invented all that she had told her. Then the brother and her husband, being excited by the news of her cruel death, flew to her, and having mourned the fate of the girl with various lamentations, committed her to the grave. Nor could the young man endure with equanimity such a miserable death of his sister, by her by whom it was by no means equitable it should have been occasioned, but, being most profoundly grieved, and wholly possessed by the noxious fury of the most vehement bile, he began from that time to burn with a raging fever, so that for him also a remedy seemed to be necessary. But his wife, who some time ago had lost the name, together with the fidelity, of a wife, went to a certain physician well known for his perfidy, who, being famous for his victories in many contests, could enumerate great trophies which his right hand had obtained, and immediately promised him 50 sestertia, in order that he, indeed, might sell poison so efficacious as to destroy in a moment, but that she might buy the death of her husband. This being done, she and the physician pretended that the most excellent potion which they had brought, and which the more learned call sacred, was necessary for mitigating pains of the viscera, and carrying off the bile. But, in its stead, they substituted a potion sacred to the health of Proserpine. And now the physician extended to the sick man, with his own hand, the well-tempered cup, his own family, and some of his friends and kindred being present. But that audacious woman, in order that she might destroy the physician, the partner of her guilt, and at the same time be enriched by the money which she had promised, retaining the cup in the sight of all of them, said, O best of physicians, you shall not give this potion to my most dear husband till you have drank a good part of it yourself. For how do I know whether a noxious poison may not be concealed in it? And this is a thing which should by no means offend you, who are a man so prudent and learned, that I, as a religious wife, being solicitous for the safety of my husband, perform a necessary duty of piety. The physician, being suddenly agitated by the desperate audacity of the cruel woman, and totally deprived of all counsel, and of every opportunity of thinking, through the shortness of the time, drank largely of the potion, before he had raised any suspicion of his evil conscience by any trepidation or delay. And the young man, following his example, took the cup, and drank what was offered to him. The present business being thus transacted, the physician prepared to return home with the greatest celerity, in order that he might extinguish the deadly power of the poison which he had taken by a salutiferous potion. But the barbarous woman, persisting in the same sacrilegious obstinacy as that which she had adopted from the first, would not suffer him to depart from her the breadth of a nail, till, as she said, the effect of the medicine was evidently proved, in consequence of the potion being distributed through the whole body. But being much, and for a long time, wearied by his prayers and earnest entreaties, she at length scarcely permitted him to depart. In the meantime his most inward parts attracted the occult destruction, which raged through all his viscera, and, at last, he with great difficulty came to his own house very ill, and now oppressed with a somnolent heaviness. Scarcely also being able to narrate every particular, he ordered his wife to demand, at least, the promised reward of a double death. And thus that most illustrious physician, being destroyed by violence, gave up the ghost. Nor did that young man live any longer than the physician, but perished by a similar kind of death, amidst the fictitious and false tears of his wife. And he, being now buried after a few days, had intervened, during which funeral rites are performed to the dead, the wife of the physician came and demanded the money which was due for the double death. But the woman, always like herself, overpowering the real form of fidelity, and exhibiting only its image, mildly answered her, and promised everything liberally and abundantly, and agreed to pay the stipulated sum without delay, only adding that she wished she could give her a little of that potion, for the purpose of accomplishing the business she had begun. This the wife of the physician, inveigled by the many snares of the most wicked frauds, readily consented to do, and, that she might render herself more acceptable to the opulent woman, hastily returned home, and immediately afterwards delivered her the whole box of poison. Having therefore now obtained the grand instrument of wickedness, she extended far and wide her sanguinary hands. She had a little daughter by the husband whom she had lately killed, and she was very indignant that the laws would necessarily give to this little one the inheritance of her father. Greedily desiring also the whole patrimony of her daughter, she waited only for an opportunity of destroying her. Being certain, therefore, that mothers received the immature inheritances of their deceased children, she showed herself to be such a parent as she had proved herself to be a wife, and pretending to prepare a dinner, in consequence of a circumstance that had occurred, she attacked with the same poison both the wife of the physician and her own daughter. But that deadly venom immediately consumed the slender life and delicate and tender viscera of the little girl. The wife of the physician, however, while the tempest of the detestable potion wandered through her lungs with its noxious windings, first suspecting what the thing was, and afterwards, through the oppression of her breath, being now more certain that her suspicion was right, went to the house of the prefect of the province, and, with a great clamour, imploring his assistance, a tumult of the people also being excited, in consequence of the disclosure she was about to make of such barbarous wickedness, she occasioned both the house and the ears of the prefect to be immediately opened. And now, having accurately narrated all the atrocities of this most cruel woman, from the beginning, being suddenly seized with a dark vertigo of the mind, she compressed her lips, which were still half open, and having for a long time produced a crashing noise by the gnashing of her teeth, she fell lifeless before the feet of the prefect. But he, though he was a man accustomed to things of this kind, would not suffer the multiform wickedness of this execrable sorceress to flag by a languid delay, but immediately ordered the chambermaids of the woman to be brought before him, and by the force of torments extorted from them the truth. He also sentenced her to a punishment which was indeed less than she deserved, namely, that she should be cast to wild beasts, because he could not find any other torment so adapted to the enormity of her guilt. With such a woman as this it was determined that I should be publicly connected, as if I had been lawfully married to her. And, being very much vexed, I waited with great anxiety for the day of the spectacle, being frequently willing to destroy myself with my own hand, rather than be defiled by coming into contact with such an abandoned woman, or be defamed by the disgrace of a public spectacle. But, as I was deprived of human hands, and was also destitute of fingers, I could by no means draw a sword with my round and imperfect hoof. However, I consoled myself, in my extreme misery, with a slender hope, because, the spring now beginning to appear, would paint everything with florid buds, and would now clothe the meadows with a purple splendor, and roses would then burst forth, exhaling the sweetest odors, which would restore me to my former Lucius, which is to say, my pristine form. Behold, the day destined to the spectacle was present, and I was led into the arena, the people following me with triumphant applause. And while the beginning of the spectacle was dedicated to the sportive dances of the players, I, in the meantime, being placed before the gate, gladly fed on the very flourishing grass which germinated at the entrance, now and then also refreshing my inquisitive eyes with the most agreeable prospect of the spectacle, because the gate was open. For boys and virgins flourishing in florid youth, conspicuous for their beauty, in splendid garments, acting as they walked, dancing the Greek Pyrrhic dance, and disposed in rank, performed graceful circuits, now turning round in an orb like a wheel, now connected by their hands in an oblique order, and afterwards being disposed into the form of a wedge with a square aperture, and then becoming separated into two troops. But after the clangor of the terminating trumpet had dissolved the manifold circuits of the reciprocal movements, the hangings being removed and the curtains folded, a representation of the fable of Paris was prepared, as follows. There was a wooden mountain made in imitation of that celebrated mountain which Homer calls Ida. This was of a lofty structure, was planted with grass plats and living trees, and from its highest top emitted river water, from a fountain flowing through the contrivance of the artist. A few goats cropped the grass, and a certain young man, excellently clothed with barbaric vestments dependent from his shoulders, and having his head covered with a golden tiara, after the manner of the Phrygian shepherd Paris, pretended to be skilled in the pastoral discipline. A beautiful boy also was present, naked, except that a robe, adapted to a child, covered his left shoulder. This boy was every way conspicuous for his yellow hair, among which little golden wings associated by a similar alliance were prominent, and the caduceus and the wand indicated that the boy was Mercury. He, running with a dancing motion, and carrying in his right hand an apple gilt with spangles, extended it to him who represented Paris, and announced to him by signs the mandate of Jupiter. Immediately after, elegantly receding, he departed from the view. A girl succeeded, of a beautiful face, and resembling the goddess Juno, for her head was begirt with a white diadem, and she also carried a sceptre. Another virgin entered, whom you might believe to be Minerva, having her head covered with a fulgid helmet, and the helmet itself was covered with an olive-colored crown. She also lifted up a shield, which is to say the aegis, and shook a spear, and appeared to be such as she is when she fights. After these another female entered, of surpassing beauty, representing Venus by the decoration of her divine colour, and such as Venus was when she was a virgin, exhibiting perfect beauty in a body naked and uncovered, except that her private parts were inumbrated by a thin silken garment, the fringe of which the busy wind, in a sufficiently amorous manner, now wantonly blew back, that, being removed, the flower of her age might be manifest, and now luxuriantly blew upon that, by close adherence, the pleasure which the members, the private parts, were formed to give might be delineated. But the colour itself of the goddess was various to the view, for her body was white because she descended from heaven, and her silken garment was azure because she emerged from the sea. And now the several virgins who represented goddesses were surrounded by their attendants. Juno indeed by Castor and Pollux, whose heads were covered with round helmets, conspicuous by the stars which glittered on their summits. But these representatives of the twin brothers were young actors. This virgin, Juno, proceeding with a tranquil and unaffected gesticulation, conformably to the various modulations of the wantonly sounding flute, promised the shepherd, by modest signs, that she would bestow on him the empire of all Asia if he adjudged to her the palm of beauty. But two boys, who represented terror and fear, the armor-bearing attendants of the warlike goddess, dancing with drawn swords, surrounded that virgin who, by the arms with which she was adorned, represented Minerva. and a piper who was behind her played a Dorian, which is to say a warlike tune, and mingling sharp tinkling with flat sounds, excited the vigor of brisk dancing, after the manner of a trumpet. This girl, by tossing her head, looking with threatening eyes, and walking with a quick and intorted step, signified to Paris by her cheerful gesticulation that, if he gave to her the victory of beauty, he should become, through her assistance, brave and illustrious by the trophies of war. Then Venus stood gracefully in the very middle of the scene, sweetly smiling, accompanied by the great applause of the spectators, and surrounded by a crowd of rejoicing boys. You would say that those smooth and fair boys were Cupids, and real Cupids, who had just then descended from heaven or emerged from the sea. For they admirably resembled them, by their small wings, their little arrows, and the rest of their external habiliments. They also bore splendid torches before their mistress, as if she had been going to some nuptial banquet. Unmarried girls likewise, a graceful progeny, were there assembled. Here the most pleasing graces, there the most beautiful hours, who, rendering their goddess propitious, by throwing flowers made into garlands, or loose, formed the most elegant choir, and soothed the goddess of pleasure with the hair of the spring. Now pipes with many perforations sweetly send forth Lydian modulations. And, while they delightfully allure the minds of the spectators, Venus, in a far more delectable manner, began placidly to move herself, and to proceed with a gentle and slow step, the spine of her back at the same time lightly undulating, and her head gradually moving. And thus she conformed her delicate gestures to the soft sound of the pipes. At one time also she gently winked, and at another sharply threatened with her eyes, and sometimes danced with them alone. This girl, as soon as she came into the presence of the judge, which is to say of the scenic Paris, seemed to promise by the motion of her arms that she would give to Paris a wife of surpassing beauty, Helen, and like herself, if he would prefer her to the other goddesses. Then the Phrygian young man delivered with a willing mind to the girl the golden apple which he held in his hands, as an indication that she had conquered. Why, therefore, do you wonder, O most vile heads, or rather forensic cattle, or still more properly gowned vultures, if all judges now sell their decisions for money? For even in the most remote periods of antiquity, favour could corrupt the judgment which was agitated between gods and men, and a young man, who was a rustic and a shepherd, being elected a judge by the decision of the great Jupiter, sold the first judicial decision for the lucre of lust, accompanied likewise by the destruction of all his race. Thus also by Hercules another judgment posterior to this was given between the illustrious leaders of the Greeks, either when Palamedes, who excelled in erudition and science, was condemned by false accusations as a traitor, or when the mendicant Ulysses was preferred to the mighty Ajax, who was preeminent in military prowess. And of what kind was that judgment which was the decision of the law-giving Athenians, who were a wise people and the master of all science? Was not that divinely prudent old man Socrates, whom the Delphic god preferred for his wisdom to all mortals, circumvented by the fraud and envy of a most iniquitous faction, as if he had been a corrupter of youth, though he restrained them as with a bridle? Was not he destroyed by the noxious juice of a pestilent herb, leaving to his fellow citizens the stain of perpetual infamy? Since even now the most excellent philosophers choose his most holy sect before all others, and swear in his name for the greatest and most earnest desire of beatitude. Lest, however, someone should blame this impetus of my indignation, thus thinking with himself, Behold now, shall we suffer an ass to philosophize to us? I shall again return to the narration from whence I digressed. After that judgment of Paris was finished, Juno indeed and Minerva departed from the theatre sad and enraged, and showed by their gestures the indignation which they felt from being rejected. But Venus, full of joy and hilarity, exhibited her gladness by dancing with all her choir. Then wine, mixed with crocus, burst forth on high from the summit of the mountain, through a certain latent tube, and flowing in scattered streams, sprinkled as it fell, and an odoriferous shower, the goats that fed round it, till being dyed into a better form, they changed their proper whiteness into a saffron colour. And now, the whole theatre exhaling a sweet odour, a gulf of the earth absorbed that wooden mountain. When, behold, a certain soldier ran through the middle of the street in order to bring, to the people now demanding it, that woman from the public prison, who, as I have said, was condemned to wild beasts on account of her multiform wickedness, and detained to be my illustrious bride. What was intended also to be our genial bed could be most distinctly seen, for it was transparent, being made from the Indian tortoise, was tumid with a plumous heap, and floored with a silken coverlet. But I, besides the shame of being publicly connected, and besides the contagion of a wicked and polluted woman, was also in the highest degree tormented with the fear of death, thus thinking with myself, that in the venereal embrace, while we were adhering to each other, whatever wild beast should be sent in to the destruction of the woman, it would not be so prudent and sagacious, or so tutored by art, or so frugal and temperate, as to lacerate the woman who was placed by my side, and spare me as one uncondemned and innoxious. Being therefore solicitous, not for my modesty, but for my life, while liberty was granted to me of indulging my own thoughts, my master being intent on aptly preparing the bed, and all his servants being partly occupied in hunting, and partly attentive to the voluptuous spectacle, no one believing that so mild an ass required to be so attentively guarded, I gradually withdrew myself by an occult flight. And when I arrived at the next gate, I hurried away with most rapid steps. When also with great celerity I had travelled over 6,000 entire paces, I arrived at Kentria, which city indeed is said to be the most noble economy of the Corinthians. But it is contiguous to the Aegean and Saronic Sea, where also there is a port, which is a most safe receptacle for ships, and is very populous. Avoiding therefore the crowd, and choosing the solitary shore, near to the eructation of the waves, there, stretched on a most soft bed of sand, I refreshed my weary body. For the chariot of the sun had declined to the last boundary of day, and sweet sleep overpowered me, when I gave myself to the evening repose. End of Chapter 10, Part 2.